Hello there, my friend, and welcome to the Ayurveda and Psychology podcast. I am Charlotte Skogsberg, your host for this podcast. I am enchanted to meet and to take you with me on this journey into the human psyche, viewed from the holistic approach of yoga and Ayurveda, and viewed from the modern man approach of clinical psychology and psychoanalysis. So have something nice to drink next to you, maybe a cup of tea, have a seat, or go out for a nice walk in nature maybe. Enjoy. Today I would like to talk to you about psychology, clinical psychology, even I would want to say psychoanalysis to begin with. And in order to talk to you about this, we need to go back to the early 1900s, 1915 actually, when Sigmund Freud, presented to us for the first time his theory on the unconscious, when he discovered the unconscious. This is not going to be a lecture on Freud or on the unconscious, but it's essential to understand that there is an unconscious. One of our biggest mistakes as we interact with other people, for instance, or simply as we look at ourselves, is to believe that, what you see is what you get, because it's actually not true. Very often we get into the struggle of understanding other people's action, reaction, and words, or even our own actions and words and reactions, because we do not understand why they take place. When we can understand that there is a part of us that we don't know in our active day conscious mind, then we can get the explanations of these action, reactions, and words coming from ourselves and from other people. But as long as we don't acknowledge that there is a part of us that we actually we don't have access to, this is when the conflict arises, or should I say the ignorance or the mistake. Very often we have tendency to not wanting to understand why people do things, and we brush it off as it is just the way it is, or I guess they weren't thinking. But still, when people are not thinking, as we say, they're still doing or acting. So where does that come from? We have to understand that there is always an intention, something driving us in every action that we take, in every reaction that we have to someone else's action, and also in every word that we use. The unconscious, the way Freud described it, is not everything that is not conscious to us, but it's everything that we have suppressed. So we need to realize that everything that we have ever been through in life, every experience, is still with us. It can't disappear, actually, because it did take place or it did happen. However, our mental capacities will process it one way or another. Now, this is where we need to understand that we come into this life with one great task, and that task is to survive. So if you can come to the realization that actually anything you do or say has one primary drive, and that is your basic survival, then you have already gained a different dimension to understanding why people do and act and say the way they do. Please understand that there is nothing random. There is nothing that is a hazard. everything has an explanation. So with that in mind, we come into this life born with our survival instinct and with a need to learn how to develop strategies in order to survive. As we are born, we are also then, of course, completely open to any new information or knowledge because we don't really come with anything else. This is not really true, but we're not going to go into that kind of details today. That will be in a different episode, if you wish for me to talk about it. But we could, to make it easy, say that we come into this life without information and then really open to any new information so that we can learn how to survive. Naturally, what we come into will be our first learning experience. And what we come into is the environment where our caretakers are. So to make it once again quite generalized and easy, knowing that this can look different for different people, we often talk about family, which would comprehend parents and, for instance, siblings, and then potentially other people who are a part of this circle of people that we could call family, right? And so they will be the first people who teaches us about the world, who gives us information about how to survive. So naturally, as you can then understand, whatever they had been taught when they came into this life will also be a part of what we will learn. This is the transgenerational learning, if you will. This is how behaviors and ideas are transformed from one generation to the next. We bring them with us as we bring a new life into this world as well. So we come into this world, and depending on when in time, where in the world, and also how the socio-economical situation is where we come, we will learn different kind of lessons. We will learn how to interact with, first of all, other people in general. We will learn how to get what we need from these other people. Because we are born completely helpless, of course. We are so in the need to belong to these people, because that's actually the most important part for us in order to survive. Since we can't give ourselves food or shelter ourselves by ourselves at that point, we need to develop a strategy to make sure that the caretakers will do that for us. It's actually the reason that babies and also baby animals are born with this feature that we have of being cute. Basically, the big eyes compared to the rest of the face, and also the big head compared to the rest of the body. It is made so that we are drawn towards this, wanting to take care of them, actually, which is why, for instance, we have also this typical happening of puppies and kittens, and that we want to take care of them when they're tiny and they look so cute, and then all of a sudden they're not as cute anymore because they've grown up, and then comes the whole struggle of what are we going to do with this animal. It's actually the same thing with babies, but we've been very, very well trained to not actually leave them behind because we've developed attachment to them. So we come into this world, we learn quickly, okay, these two people, for instance, mother and a father, let's just say, to make it very easy, okay? I need to belong to them, and so I need to make sure that they will want to take care of me. So I learned very early on how to attach to them. And that attachment is survival, okay? So just even using those words, you might even have now some things triggered happening, some processes triggered in your mind of attachment, survival, belonging. Wow, yes, it is essential for us, which is why later on in life it feels like dying when we feel like we are not being attached to someone, for instance. We also learn that this is how we need to act in order to get the attention that we need, but we also see how they interact with each other. So for instance, let's say that we've grown up in a heteronormal, as they call it, family, with a mother and a father, and that they are our mother and our father. We see then how women and men interact with one another, and we see also how we relate to women and men. And then a little bit later we will understand the difference between the generations, so that there's a difference between me and mother and father, and then me and my siblings, for instance, and even more so later on, me and the peer, so basically the other children that has the same age as me, the same generation as me. So we start to develop these social behaviors, right? And at the same time as we develop these social behaviors, we also develop the understanding of what is accepted on my behalf by the others and what is not accepted on my behalf by the others. What I mean by this is that we will be extremely authentic as we come into this world, right? But because our parents then, and the other people around us as well usually, show us quite quickly that some behaviors that we are showing that are completely authentic are accepted and some are not, we will choose to suppress certain and then put into an emphasis on some. We will notice that, for instance, when we smile, people will enjoy that and be drawn towards it, which is why we will keep on smiling. We will also notice, for instance, that when we're crying, now this is at that stage, right, on the very early stages, when we are crying, we will get attention. This stays with us much later on in life as well. However, we will also come to a point where we are being taught that crying is not always acceptable either. So there's already conflict that will come into our thought process when it comes to showing negative emotions. We will notice that it creates a reaction in other people, but we will also be taught, once we've come to the, let's say, speaking age, that showing these negative emotions are not preferable because it makes other people uncomfortable when we show them. So we will begin then to suppress them at one stage. And this is when some really important emotional states come into our existence, such as the feeling of fear, of course, that's triggered as soon as there's the threat to our survival. And then comes in guilt and shame when we are doing things and when we're acting in a way that is not acceptable by our peers or our parents, by society. We are being showed, and we're usually being showed in the reward and punishment kind of way, right? And that is by conditioning. So conditioning is to learn to someone or to teach someone a behavior to have by giving a reward when we're doing what is looked as, seemed as positive, and then being punished when we do things that are not accepted. So accepted, non-accepted, reward, punishment. That's how we condition someone, and that's exactly how we all are brought into this world. There is not one single person in this world who has not been through this. It doesn't matter how much of a hippie community you grew up in, you were still taught these patterns. Because the thing is, your parents were taught these patterns, so even if they rebelled against them, they still had them with them, and they were conditioned into them, which means that it's a very, very high level of learned behavior. Now, all of these things that we learn so early on in life, we keep it with us, of course, forever. And the reason that we don't actually remember most of it is because we would go completely crazy if we had to keep everything that we learn in the conscious part, let's say, of our mind. So what happens is that everything is stored, okay? It's stored inside of us in the whole organism, which is important to remember because we keep thinking very often that it's a question of the head, but that's not the case. It's actually stored into the whole of your organism, and there's different reasons for that. And what will happen is that it will be put, let's say, in different parts of ourselves, in different drawers of of a dresser, for instance. And the way Freud would see it then was that everything that we suppress is pushed into what he would call then the unconscious. The biggest issue with the unconscious for us is that it will control everything in our life, especially because it's in the unconscious. So there are things that are in the unconscious, and if we can, by some magic, right, bring it away from the unconscious and into the conscious, then all of a sudden it will lose the control that it has over our life. And if you will, this is the whole idea of therapy, actually. This is also what Freud realized. It was that when things came from this forgotten part of us and into the conscious part of us, it would actually destigmatize, it would be less important, and all of a sudden lose its power over us. And one of the ways that we can see how this process works is by repetition. So there are things that we do that we keep on doing always the same way. And most of us can look into our life and see, oh yes, there's definitely things that I keep on doing. I repeat these patterns of behaviors, for instance. I don't really know where they're coming from, and most of the time I tend to just label them as just who I am, right? And once the reason for these repetitions comes into our conscious mind instead, we change the behaviors. And you can see this in different parts of your life. There's stuff that you did at one point in your life that you kept on always doing, and then through some miracle, because maybe something happened, that you also became more aware of yourself, then you, without even trying it actually, because that's part of who we are as well, we actually strive for integration of this part. That's the reason that we repeat it actually. Our organism, we have to understand that our organism, our mind and all of that only wants what's best for us actually, which means that we do things because somewhere we believe that it is what is serving us. And the parts of our unconscious that we keep on repeating, keep repeating it so that we will become aware of it. Now, if there are things in my unconscious that aren't serving me, ideas about myself and about the world, that makes me do things because this is then the part of me that is controlling me, it will manifest in my day-to-day life as destructive behavior, for instance. Because once again, the parts that are in the unconscious part of ourselves are always things that we want to suppress. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all bad stuff. It just means that for some reason or another, when it came into our existence, we decided to push it away. So, the reason that it's not necessarily bad stuff is because, as I was mentioning earlier on, the way we will structure our strategies for survival will very much depend on the people who are bringing us up. It will very much depend on when in time that happened and where in the world that happened and what was their situation. So there are things that were seemingly not negative per se, but because of what I was taught, I learned that that was not good for my survival instinct to keep in mind. So let's say, for instance, that there is an idea that I am someone wonderful just the way I am, perfect actually, and someone who is capable of achieving everything, someone who lives in symbiosis with nature and other people around me. Let's say that that is something that I've come to understand or believe, that I have with me. And then I'm growing up in an environment that is far more hostile, which means that by believing that everything will happen to me, that everything is good, everything good happens to me, there is a risk that I put myself in a vulnerable position and therefore risk my survival. However, if I'm then instead taught that I need to be suspicious towards everything around me, and that is how I survive, this idea of everything is perfect and everything will turn out well is not serving me, and so I will push it into the unconscious. It then starts to make sense to you when I'm saying this, that there's a lot of stuff in my unconscious that is actually really good for me, but that I don't know. So what I want to say with all of this is that the person that you are today is far beyond the surface level of what you see is what you get. You came into this life with the drive to survive, and you learned early on how to position yourself in order to do so. You learned then to adopt certain behaviors and to push away other behaviors in order to feel that you survive, because it means that you are belonging to the group. And depending on many variables outside of yourself, you would learn one strategy more than another. We develop what is called in clinical psychology defense mechanisms, which basically are these unconscious strategies that we switch on, that we've learned early on. We switch them on when we are detecting a threat in the external environment. This threat is then represented as a danger for us somehow, and it triggers the feeling of fear inside of us, which is our most prominent survival instinct, right? That's what fear is. And then these strategies that we have developed unconsciously, that we are not aware of, that we call defense mechanisms, come in whenever we need to defend ourselves, as the word says, as the name says, against this potential danger around us. Now, there's a difference between these defense mechanisms that we are not aware of and what is very often and commonly used today as the word coping strategies. Okay, the coping side of ourselves is actually something that is much more adaptable, and it's also something that we do being aware of them. Now, it doesn't mean that we're aware of the reason that we do them, but we're aware of doing them, whereas the defense mechanisms, we are not even aware of that we're doing them, which is why it's so difficult to detect them for ourselves, and which is usually what the professional is there to do in the beginning, actually, to begin to detect these defense mechanisms, such as denial, suppression. The fact of forgetting something, for instance, is very much a defense mechanism. And we will have the difference between denial and simple lying. To lie is something that we do, that we are aware of, and that is much more of a coping strategy, whereas denial is something that we are convinced that is true, is a defense mechanism. Now, the lying in itself we're aware of, but we don't always know why, right? Or let's say the drive behind it, what really makes us want to lie in a situation. And so as we go into the therapeutical room, what we do is that we sit with the person on the other side of the table or behind the couch, if it's a Freudian psychoanalyst, and they try to decipher throughout our discourse, throughout what we're saying, all these different strategies and mechanisms as a way to begin to understand what it is that we're trying to fight against. It really is this idea of struggling in the battlefield with the dragon that is represented by this danger that we believe that we have. Now, the danger in itself would be so much easier to detect if we were aware of us seeing it as a danger. We're not, because that also belongs to the unconscious. So what we are aware of is the strategy and the fact that we get the feeling of fear coming to the surface. Now, there's a lot of information that I've given you today, and it's just a way to bring into your awareness the fact that who you are today is the sum of everything that you've learned since birth. And that you came to survive and developed ways to survive depending on what this information looked like or what you were taught. And it also depends then on what your parents were taught, because they will then bring that on to you as well. And just like in Ayurveda, in that sense, we are then sitting here today in this rather unbalanced state most of the time and just trying to juggle with what we've got in order to make peace with what we have around us, which is nature and other people, and even more so, the struggle with our own internal conflicts. And so just like the goal, let's say, of yoga and Ayurveda is to become aware of our true nature, this is exactly what the therapeutical tool is. This is exactly what psychoanalysis and clinical psychology wants to do. It's to bring into the light of awareness, bring into the conscious mind your true nature. Because once we bring that into the conscious mind, like I mentioned earlier, it loses the control that it has over us. We destigmatize it and we can change it for something that serves us instead. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast and this episode. I am very grateful. If you enjoyed this and you think that other people could enjoy this, please help me to spread the word. Share this episode on any channel that you have of social media or messaging. And even more so, I would really appreciate if you know one other person who might benefit from my words today specifically. Take that 1 minute it takes to simply share this episode with one person. Remember that there's a human being on the other side of your phone, of your earpods, of this microphone. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what I've been talking about. So please leave a comment. Send me a message directly if you wish. This is Charlotte. This is me. See you next time. Namaste.